Perry Bellegarde wants his and other First Nations and Aboriginal voices to be heard, and that is why he is voting in the upcoming federal election. And we welcome from Regina, Saskatchewan, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Perry Bellegarde. Grand Chief, it's good of you to join us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Not at all. Well, the introduction suggests you are voting, so that's where I'm going to start. Who are you going to vote for, Chief?
Again, I'll be voting. It's a secret ballot, so that's going to be between me and the Creator.
Okay, fair enough. How about this? Have you made a decision that you can tell us about in terms of who you're not going to be voting for?
Well, I'm going to be looking at all the party platforms. We put out a document called Closing the Gap, which we sent to all the main party leaders. We want a formal response to that. The document speaks to investments in education and training, access to potable water, investments in housing, dealing with the education backlog on post-secondary, looking at language revitalization, looking at an implementation strategy and plan for the Truth and Reconciliation recommendation. So we want a formal response. And we need to see that, and we want to get that formal response out to our First Nations chiefs and leaders across Canada so an informed decision can be made. Which party is really getting it? Which party is starting to make strong policy, program, recommendations and plans as it relates to closing the gap in the document we put forward? So that's where everybody should be leaning towards. Which party is starting to say, yes, we need to make investments now to close the gap in Canada?
I, as you were speaking, was brandishing a copy, if you like, of Closing the Gap, and I've had a chance to look at it. And this is the first line that I want to read back to you. Elections, you say, are really about the hopes and dreams of making lives better. For those seeking election, it is about listening, understanding, and acting. Closing the gap in the quality of life between First Nations and Canada builds a stronger, healthier country for all of us. We need change now. We must close the gap. Okay, a number of questions emerging from that. You have had, when I say you, I mean you and your predecessors for that matter, have often had stormy relationships with the prime ministers and first ministers, premiers of this country. But that is a very hopeful, optimistic tone you've taken in that opening. And I wonder why you chose that tone to open your document with.
Well, basically, again, as prime ministers, as premiers, as leaders, they've got to listen. And the comment, what I'm trying to do with the first line about closing the gap is good for all of us. We've got to listen, we've got to sit down, we have to have a dialogue. And let's put the best strategy and plan going forward and collaboratively and cooperatively work together on joint policy statements, joint programs, and even legislation that will have a positive impact for everybody across this land. And so we have to work with whoever gets elected on October 19 as First Nations people. And we have to make sure that we have access, we have dialogue, but a really respectful and a cooperative working relationship, because the status quo is not working. Maintaining the gap is not good for this country. And we have to close that. And what I'm talking about when I say the gap, and a lot of people don't, what is the chief talking about?
Well, I'll get into that. Hold off on that. I am going to get to the gap because it is important that we get that on the record. But you just said the status quo is not working. You just said in your document, we need change now. It would be, I mean, it's not too much of a stretch to infer that you think people ought not to vote Conservative by using that language. Fair to say?
Again, as AFN, we're nonpartisan. We're a nonpartisan organization. Again, I will work with whoever gets elected October 19. You know, in terms of developing a relationship, you need respect, you need access, you need to have dialogue. You need things jointly developed. And when I talk about a change, I'm talking about the change in relationships with the Crown, change in relationships with the governments, a respect for Aboriginal rights and title and treaty implementation, all of the above. And that means having access, having dialogue, and cooperatively working together. And if the status quo, you know, that we have right now is maintained, it's not good for our people, it's not good for this country. So the relationship overall has to change, no matter who gets in on October 19.
Understood. The turnout by Canadians in the last federal election was not that great. The turnout among Indigenous Canadians, First Nations on reserves, was even worse, 44%. Why do you think so few Indigenous Canadians take part in Canadian elections?
Well, again, the voter turnout is so low amongst First Nations people because people have to remember we did not get the right to vote till 1961. So we weren't allowed to participate. So that's one of the reasons. So there's a lot of feeling of it's not our government. So that still persists because we had our own systems of government. And so now being allowed to participate since 1961, people are saying, well, okay, it's there. There's some apathy, but it's not our government. There's also feelings of marginalization. There's poverty. There's feelings of, well, my vote's not going to make a difference anyway. And so now, as well, with the Fair Elections Act, there's other barriers because being accessible to the ballot box. You know, in a lot of cases, we have fly-in communities in the north. If there's no ballot box in the community, how are they going to get out to the ballot box to exercise the right to vote? So there are challenges with perception. There's challenges with the 2 pieces of ID that are required now. There's challenges about transportation. So that's why the voter turnout is so low. And there's also an education and awareness piece that's been missing, you know, about we need our people educated and aware that their issues matter, our people matter, and their vote matters. Because we can influence 51 ridings if we get the vote out. And that's the message we're trying to get to every possible member of parliament and every potential prime minister. You have to listen to our issues now because we are trying to get the vote out or mobilize the vote.
I want to make sure that I'm accurately characterizing the internal debate that you yourself had in deciding to vote in this election. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think for a while you said you were not going to vote out of respect for the elders. Then you said, okay, maybe I should vote after all. Help us understand why that internal debate within yourself.
It was a really personal and internal debate because our chiefs and our leaders and our elders over the years growing up always said, you know, we have a treaty relationship with the Crown, nation to nation. And no matter who gets into government, the Crown has to respect, has to abide by, and implement and live by that treaty relationship with the Crown. And we don't have a relationship with the Liberal Party, or the NDP Party, or the Conservative Party, or the Greens. It's the relationship with the Crown. And so that was a teaching always brought to our people growing up. And so that's why when people asked the question, well, do you vote? Well, historically, I haven't. But having since talked to the elders and the chiefs and the youth, and even our regional chiefs, they're saying, you know, we have to lead by example. And we're trying to get the vote out. So it just makes sense for the leadership to show that and go out and exercise your personal sovereignty as an individual and go out and vote.
Okay,
so that's why now I will be doing that.
Very good. One more question on this before we talk about the gap itself that you were talking about earlier. I noticed that there are, in terms of Aboriginal candidates running in this election, 16 for the Liberals, 16 for the New Democrats, 4 for the Conservatives, 4 for the Greens. Do I infer from that Indigenous Canadians feel more comfortable in the Liberal and New Democratic parties than they do in the Conservative or Green parties?
You could make that reference or that thought along that line. I'm just thankful that we do have First Nations Aboriginal representatives and candidates in all parties. That's the positive thing, because I've always said this. We need to get First Nations people around decision-making tables, whether that be cabinet, whether that be in their respective caucuses, whether that be on boardroom tables, whether that be on the National Energy Board, on Supreme Court of Canada. We need to see First Nations people involved in those key decision-making institutions because they make decisions on policy, program, legislation that affect our lives. And so I'm just thankful that there are First Nations people in all the major parties, and we need to keep doing more.
Very good. Let's talk about the gap that you want to see closed. That gap,
Yes.
in your mind, consists of what?
The gap that I keep continually referring to is, according to the United Nations Human Development Index, Canada is rated 6th in terms of quality of life, very high up. But when you apply those same indices to First Nations people, we're 63rd. That's what needs to be addressed, because that gap is not good for our people, it's not good for Canada. And so that gap represents so many things. It represents the high suicide rates amongst our young people. It represents the 40,000 Aboriginal children in foster care. It represents the 1,200 missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls. We're 4.3% of the population, but we have 25% of the jails filled by our people. It represents the overcrowded housing. It represents the cap on education funding. It represents the 2% funding cap that's been there for 20 years. So that's the gap that needs to be addressed. And we need to invest now in education and training and in housing, access to potable water, mental health, childcare. That's what has to be addressed, because when that's addressed, we not only win as First Nations people, Canada as a country will win, because there's a high social cost to maintaining that 6th versus 63rd gap. And that's why we're calling on all Canadians to make sure that they question those potential members of Parliament. We're asking all Canadians to push Mr. Trudeau and Mulcair and Harper and Elizabeth on all these things that this is good for this country. Make key strategic investments now. That's why we have to close the gap, and that's why I get so excited and so passionate about it, because it's really in the best interests of Canada as a country. It's not acceptable in 2015 to maintain the status quo and this poverty that exists. It's not acceptable. We need the change. We need to change now.
Okay, completely understand that definition of the gap. However, I also note in your report that you have come out strongly against C-51, the so-called anti-terrorism bill, and I wonder why that is a priority for you in a report that I thought was supposed to shine a light on the gap that you see in other social services and opportunities in the country. Why is C-51 in there?
Well, Bill C-51 is only one piece of legislation that needs to be overhauled. It's a bad piece of legislation. You know, it makes our own people terrorists. When we stand up to protect the land and the water, you know, because that's our responsibility. You know, we support developments, but only if it's balanced, that the land and the water are protected. So when we stand up and say, hey, we got to make sure that the land and the water is protected, we can be classified as terrorists according to Bill C-51. So that's why we're saying it's not only Bill C-51, it's a whole suite of legislation that there has to be a federal law review so that all of these laws that have been unilaterally developed with no consultation nor consent from Indigenous peoples have to be brought in line with Section 35 of Canada's own Constitution, which recognizes existing Aboriginal treaty rights, has to be brought in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which speaks to free, prior, informed consent when anything's being developed. So it has to be a suite of federal law reviews, not just Bill C-51, Bill C-38, Bill C-45, you know, the bill dealing with the Transparency Act. There has to be a review, and it should all be brought in line with what I just mentioned.
Okay, let me get back to the gap again. As I understand it, First Nations people in this country do have things such as drug coverage, dental coverage, vision care coverage, those kinds of things that other Canadians would also have. So be a little bit specific with us here. Where is the gap in terms of health care services to First Nations people? Where is that gap the biggest?
Oh, there's a huge health care gap. You know, there's a huge health care services. You know, children are dying in the north from simple things like measles, strep throat, you know, and the nursing services, the access to doctor services in the north is huge. So that's a prime example of where there's almost two levels of healthcare systems. You know, when you talk about the non-insured health benefits program, that has to be reviewed because, you know, in terms of the medicine chest in Treaty Number 6, there will be a medicine chest kept at the House of the Indian Agent. The spirit and intent to healthcare was one of the promises. So looking at the healthcare system now, why is it, if there was an equitable and same healthcare system applicable to First Nations people, there's such a huge gap in the health quality of life? You know, so when you talk about dental care and eye care, those are just two of the programs under the non-insured health benefits. And that program has to be reviewed. It has to be brought up to the same standards and accessibility as everybody else in Canada. We don't want a two-tiered healthcare system. We should have access to the same quality of health as everybody else does. And right now, that's not happening.
All right, let me follow up with this. There is a Health Canada document which reads as follows. Mental wellness depends on access to a full spectrum of culturally competent supports and services. And I want to get a better understanding of what you take culturally competent to mean.
Again, when we talk about health of an individual, there's four components. There's the mind, body, spirit, but it's mental health, spiritual health, physical health. It's all those four quadrants that have to be in balance. And so when you start talking about the mental health of our people, because there's been so much trauma, there's been so much oppression from the residential schools and in the Indian Act, because we've been subject to genocide via those systems, there's trauma, there's family breakup, there's individual issues in terms of identity. And so dealing with mental health, the mental health continuum, which we've been working on at the Assembly of First Nations, is necessary from a cultural perspective. Having access to elders in our teachings, having access to make sure that the language is understood, the ceremonies are accessible. It's making sure you bring back that whole mental health spectrum, but keeping the quadrants all in balance in those four sectors. And that's what we talk about from a culturally relevant perspective. We have our own way of getting well. You know, a good example is down the road at Fort Capel. We have an all-nations healing hospital. When you walk through those doors at that hospital, you can choose Western medicine to get well or First Nations medicine. There's a sweat lodge that's part of the hospital. That's an example of bringing the best of both worlds.
Understood. In our last few minutes here, let me ask you, Chief Bellegarde, whether you've had a chance to meet all four of the major party leaders in this country. Have you?
Over the past 7 months as national chief, I can say yes, I've had the opportunity to meet all 4 national leaders. We've invited all the national leaders out to our July Chiefs meeting. Mr. Trudeau was there, Mr. Mulcair was there, Miss Elizabeth May was there. Mr. Harper did not make that meeting. And so the answer is yes, I did meet with Mr. Harper back in January for the first time as Prime Minister. And that's the whole point. We need to have better access to decision makers. We need to have better access to the Prime Minister and Cabinet and ministers on a regular basis so we can have that dialogue and develop policies and programs jointly, not unilaterally.
If you have met all 4, and you say you have, can you tell us which one you think you have the most simpatico with? Who can you best do business with?
They're all, again, I'm not going to pick any one. I'll say they're all good because any leader that offers themselves up to public life and public service, you lift them up because it's a tough job. Public service to Canada, public service to the provinces as premiers or any leader. You lift them all up because it's all about making a change, making a difference. And so I've got to work with anybody that gets elected October 19th, and that's where I'll leave my answer. No matter who gets elected as Prime Minister, I've got to sit down and meet with them and their cabinet right away and make sure that we work together on strategies and programs and policy and legislation to close the gap. And they have to get it that it's in the best interests of this country in order to make those investments now.
In which case, let's finish on this. It was a 44% turnout for Indigenous on-reserve Canadians in the 2011 election. What do you think you can nudge that number up to this time?
Any improvement on the 44% of Aboriginal engagement will be a plus. You know, if it goes up to 45, it's still increased. You know, we would hope that one day see a larger percentage of voters because our issues matter. Our lives matter, our people matter, and our vote matters. So I want to keep that going positively in a positive way going forward. So any increase above the 44% will be viewed as a positive result.
Understood. Perry Bellegarde, National Chief of the Assembly First Nations, it's good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.